This episode, I'm joined by Geoffrey Winthrop-Young to discuss the work of Friedrich Kittler. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Geoffrey Winthrop-Young, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you, James.
We are going to be discussing the work and, in part, the life of Friedrich Kittler, who was a literary scholar, a media theorist, fairly controversial. His works relate to technology, war, discourse, and with influences all over the shot, really, which we'll get to. Relatively recent figure, only passed away in 2011, wrote a lot. So there is a lot of ground here to cover, and a lot of my questions are from 3 or 4 articles that you sent me, but also your own book, Kittler and the Media, from the Theory and Media series, published in 2010, which is a sort of an introduction primarily in relation to Kittler and media, because there is a lot of work. So, with all that said, Geoffrey, please just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and not just how you came across Kittler's work, but what was he like? Because you spent some time with him, I believe.
Yes. So my name is Geoffrey Winthrop-Young, and I teach German and Nordic studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I grew up in Germany. I'm a Brit, but I grew up in Germany, and I graduated from high school in 1980. And I straight away went to the University of Freiburg to pursue an MA. And by pure chance, the very first seminar I went to, without knowing anything about the institution or the people teaching there, was a seminar on the German poet Gottfried Benn, taught by PD, that's private lecturer, Privatdozent, Friedrich Kittler. So he was my very first exposure to the German university system, and some would say it could only go downhill from there. I had a very good relationship with him in the beginning. I had a bit of a leg up. He kind of had an Anglophile streak. He was able to talk about Pink Floyd and other things with me, and I was able to respond in German. We had a slight falling out about 1 year into my studies, and there was no contact anymore. And then roughly about 1983, through a common acquaintance, he got back in touch with me. He was starting to write what turned out to be his most successful book, Gramophone Film Typewriter, and he needed somebody to translate a 1-act play by J.M. Barrie of Peter Pan fame, The 12-Pound Look. And so I translated it, but unfortunately it never made it into the book because he chose Carl Schmitt instead, which is the only time you will ever hear J.M. Barrie and Carl Schmitt in one sentence. I was under the impression that I would get some money, which I did not. So I went to his office hour again, complained because I was broke. And he was very generous. He didn't give me any money, but we rekindled our contact. And for the last 2 years of my studies in Freiburg, I went to him on an irregular basis to his office hour and had a very good relationship. And we spent most of our time discussing A, the war, which of course was a big topic, B, the English education system, which for him was also a topic of interest, but most importantly, the work of Thomas Pynchon, because I knew Pynchon and I was able to discuss certain things, Americanisms, which he was not familiar with. I should say, however, that as intellectually impressive as he was, one of the reasons why I didn't have any contact with him was that I refused to go to his seminars. I did not like the atmosphere very much. That said, he was the most impressive academic I've ever come across. An incredible intellectual breadth, an incredible analytical sharpness, and a great curiosity to find our own ways of thinking and to challenge basic presuppositions. So it was a bit of an initiation rite, but I kind of stepped back after a while because he was like a firework, and fireworks are best enjoyed from a certain distance.
What was the atmosphere of the lectures like?
Already then, something began which, by all accounts, became a great deal stronger, especially in his final years in Berlin. it was a fairly cliquish atmosphere. You were either in or you were out. It was a bit like, this is a 1970s reference, a disco, with Friedrich Kittler posing as John Travolta and his disciples posing with French names like with cheap polyester suits. So you were either in or you were out. And the problem was that after a while, as in so many cases, as with successful politicians and successful academics, provocation turns into predictability. You knew that he was trying to do something else, and after a while, you knew what was coming out. And this was reinforced in a seminar atmosphere where there was an expectation that he should be doing this and not the other stuff. So talking one-on-one was much more rewarding.
Okay. And so your book was released in 2010. Did he ever have the chance to comment on what was his appreciation of secondary scholarship on his own work?
This is a tough one. The English book, the polity book, is not the first book I wrote in Kittler. The first book I wrote in Kittler was, in fact, a German book. I was contacted in roughly 2002, 2003 by the German publisher Unius that specializes in introduction. And the person that contacted me was the late Cornelia Fissmann, the great scholar on raw media technology, who had cooperated with Kittler and knew Kittler well. And so she basically wrote an email saying, based on the introduction you did for the translation of Gramophone Film Typewriter, and based on 2 or 3 other articles, we are asking you to write an introduction in German. And I wrote back basically, why me? This was not fishing for compliments. This was just genuine curiosity. And Cornelia, who was very classy and diplomatic, wrote back between the lines, look, we know that there are people in Germany who might do a better job, but we need somebody from the outside and we need somebody from a distance, and it doesn't get any more distant than Vancouver. So I wrote that book, and that was the only time after I left Freiburg in 1986 that I was in contact with him, because he wrote a very short, very gracious letter a few months after the book had appeared, thanking me. And that was the only contact I ever had for the last 20 years of his life. To this day, I do not know whether he looked at the English book. I do not know whether he looked even at our translation of Gramophone Film Typewriter. He was very strange in the way that while he did come to the US on several occasions, he was not a great self-promoter abroad and actually not too interested. With regard to your general question, there are sometimes snide remarks regarding people who have written about him. He could be very, very ungracious, dealing with people of whom he thought that he didn't get what he was saying.
Okay. The sort of cliche impression, biographically speaking, seems to be of a sort of a chain-smoking German bulldog type who is very disagreeable.
I would say the bulldog, that he was actually physically a rather frail person, but the chain smoking is absolutely correct. I've never seen a man on so intimate terms with a cigarette. So he always was smoking French cigarettes, and he was a chain smoker. He could be extremely charming, extremely gracious, and great, great fun. It was just that there was this slight tendency towards abrasiveness. And also, you need to work at yourself in order to get into his good books, by which I mean that in your written seminar papers, in your contributions, you had to show that you were willing to question yourself and that you were willing to set aside basic ontological or discursive categories with which you'd grown up. If not, he was not too interested in you. There was also a great emphasis on facticity. There is a bit, remember Dickens' Hard Times, there's a bit of Thomas Gradgrind in him. Facts, sir, teach them facts. Sometimes he got them wrong, and he didn't take too kindly to you pointing that out.
I see. So to move into his work, the quickest way in, I think the quickest way is to get these foundations, especially with philosophy, it's usually a case of influences. And I'm sure more biography probably will come up as we get into war, especially, and things like, well, actually, biography will probably come up already again, because when we speak of influences, when I mentioned earlier in the beginning that his influences are all over the place, well, one key influence is Pink Floyd. But at the same time, we of course have central philosophical influences as well. So I guess one question is, who is it who is influencing his work? But another question would be, because of that sort of fragmentary and strange nature of what we might consider, Pink Floyd as sort of low theory in their lyrics versus the high theory of philosophy, is there a central thread from the influences that he's bringing together?
This is a tough one. I would bracket Pink Floyd for a second, because that is less an influence than an extremely effective way of explaining what the theory is about. He certainly was an immense fanboy of Pink Floyd, but it's not like he's taking Pink Floyd as a philosophical influence. If I had to summarize it, you have to cut out many names, but it boils down to four names. On the one hand, very, very classical German philosophy, and that is above all Nietzsche and absolute paramount influence Heidegger. There is a bit of Hegel there too, which I actually find quite interesting, but it really is Heidegger, and in the end he returns to him. And then there's something, and that made him infamous or famous in the beginning. He was one of the very first German scholars to fully engage with what in those days was called post-structuralism, which is a term he hated. And here it is, in particular, Foucault and Lacan, far less Derrida. There's this meme going around calling him the Derrida of the digital age, but that really doesn't apply. And if you take these four together, you've got the four key influences. Later on, as of the 80s, comes the technical influence, Shannon and Norbert Wiener and these people. But those four are there in the beginning, with the caveat that towards the end of his career, say in the last 15 years of his life, the French influence is absorbed by Heidegger, in the sense that what made Lacan and Foucault worth talking about was that they were almost talking like Heidegger. Just as what made Heidegger worth talking about was that he was almost talking like Kittler.
Okay. Well, Foucault, I believe I'm right in thinking Foucault on his deathbed said something about Heidegger right at the end, even though he rarely mentions Heidegger. Right at the end, he said it was all back to Heidegger.
And Kittler quotes this. It is strange that of the three French master thinkers with whom he's often associated, he had the least contact with Foucault. He tried to invite him to Freiburg, and Foucault kept turning him down. And there's this one famous scene, the only time he ever saw Foucault, which was in, of all places, Bayreuth, at the legendary performance of The Ring of the Nibelung, the very last performance by Pierre Boulez and Patrice Chéreau. And he caught sight of Foucault surrounded by a group of admirers laughing. But just like Dante approaching his Beatrice, he said, "I did not dare approach him." And it is, in a way, a symbolic place, because the whole world of Wagner, which was even more important to him than Pink Floyd, although there's not a big difference between Pink Floyd and Wagner and Kittler's world, was that the world of Wagner, the media technologically mobilized universe, was the end of Foucault, something Foucault wouldn't deal with. But you are absolutely right. If you read the very early essays, and if you read some of the footnotes, he already in the 70s says that Foucault's discourse analysis, as put forward especially in The Order of Things, which is one of his favorite books, is already Heideggerian history of being Seinsgeschichte. He doesn't spell it out, but in the end he says, look, Foucault was trying to reformulate something that Heidegger was trying to formulate. So there's an absorption, and Foucault himself said so.
Okay. Well, a big question, because so I guess before we get forward, how many books did Kittler write?
It depends what you count as books, but there are the big book. There are books which hardly anybody reads, like his dissertation that already counts as a book. Then there are various editions, but the big books are Discourse Networks, then Gramophone Film Typewriter, Then there's a book, A Cultural History of Cultural Studies, Kulturgeschichte, Kulturwissenschaften. And then there are the two big books, which are the beginning of the great 7-work opus, which never ended. On top of that, there are several smaller books. So we're talking upwards of 15 books, and we're talking upwards of 200 academic papers at least.
The reason I said there's so much work that for me to ask, what is the question or the purpose for Kittler's philosophy, I guess, at the beginning, if there is such a thing as a change over time? What is this? What is driving him with what seems, from what I've read, a sort of almost I don't want to say an anger, but there's an emotional element. It seems there is an emotional element that is driving him forward. Like the quest for truth for him, or the quest of philosophy for him, is not one of simply just working things out. There is almost an impatience to his philosophy.
Okay, James, let's do the following. At the risk of simplifying it beyond all responsible appreciation of Kittler, let's try to get to the very center of it. Kittler is pursuing one of the great theory dreams of the modern age, of the 20th century, and that is the quest to identify generative rules that determine the production of larger texts and utterances as effectively and systematically as phonetic, linguistic, and syntactic rules determine the production of sounds, words, and sentences. And that, of course, is the great dream of Foucault. We have a discontinuous sequence of orders of knowledge in history, and each can be analyzed by looking at the relationship between that which is said and that which can be said. And that, of course, is updating of Heideggerian Seinsgeschichte, that history is basically a sequence of ontological regimes. And now Kittler comes in and says, yes, fine, but you are still talking too abstract. How do these orders of knowledge, what he will call discourse networks, change? And he says they are related and arise from changes in the way media are implemented. And by media, he does not only mean gadgets, stuff with springs and knobs. He means the very way in which the acquisition, production, circulation of language and data is determined in a given society. So he's coming in and saying, look, my anger, to pick up on your very perceptive observation, my anger is directed against the Frankfurt School. It is directed against classical history, classical philosophy. It is directed against any philosophy that is still caught up in the idea that you are a subject defined by the fact that you are in charge of the words you speak. And I read Lacan, and I know that is not true. Language subjects you, and language subjects you. You become a subject of language, and thereby somebody who believes that they are in control of it. And I have read Foucault, who says this is true, but this actually goes through various historical stages. And I will now, to create my habilitation thesis, my second great dissertation, write a book in which I show how this operated around 1800 and how this operated around 1900. And the big change occurs towards the end of the 19th century with the arrival of analog media that radically changed the way in which societies process data. So this is at the core of it. It is a media theoretically informed take on the way in which we are made to speak.
Does so you mentioned earlier Nietzsche, Heidegger, Foucault, and Hegel. Nietzsche, Heidegger, Foucault, and Lacan as the four main ones, but with a little hint of Hegel on the side.
Yeah.
This Hegelian sense then seems to come in here. You mentioned earlier about that Kittler is critical of the term post-structuralism. Would I be right in thinking that that might be because that little Hegelian influence is with regards to how there is a progression in history, but it's now a progression of how the media is changing throughout time? And the question there I have is, For Kittler, was there an agency? Was what, in a Hegelian sense, what would be the culmination of the media? A dumbing down, a decomplexification of language and utterance?
First off, James, to quickly go back to what he calls in German Unbegriff, the unterm, the acronymous term post-structuralism. He saw what I think most people would agree with now, and that is that it is as dumb a term as French theory or indeed German media theory. It throws many people into one pot who would never go into that pot together willingly. But in those days, I mean, I'm now thinking back to the early 80s, we were sometimes under the impression that this was such a coherent, goose-stepping bunch that you could only understand Foucault by knowing what Foucault and Derrida had screamed at each other in the Parisian metro 2 weeks ago, because it was such a tightly knit group, which of course is not true. But to your big question, here, certainly not all Kittlerians or people who none would agree, but I believe that you're onto something. Towards the end of his life, he returned to ancient Greece, and he returned to Homer, and he returned to the Greek vowel alphabet to start a new history of being, which would trace the Greek vowel alphabet all the way to the implementation of the computer and Alan Turing's universal machine. This makes sense against the Hegelian background. You had a unitary symbol system in the beginning, the vowel alphabet. You then had a breaking apart into various media, and then you had a synthesis today with the machine that can simulate all other machines. Somewhere in Berlin, in his graveyard, Hegel is nodding. The second thing is, what Hitler used to say is, we need not talk about a world spirit, obviously, but there is a processing agent which at one point used you and me as a platform. And that, of course, is again in philosophy. That is that the absolute spirit reaches self-consciousness in the human mind. And then Kittler just proposed it goes on further. It is nature recursively feeding itself into itself. At one point, we, human beings, you and me, were fairly substandard platforms, and this has now been taken over by something else. So there is a Hegelian story of a machine world spirit, a media world spirit that went through a fairly, he would never say dialectic, but a sequence where there's a splitting and a coming together, a sense of anticipation, a sense of looking back, which in the end all comes together in the great universal machine.
Was he personally averse to, I mean, so 1943, he's born 1943 through to 2011. So he's going really, I guess, from quite literally writing analog letters with pen and ink all the way through to copious amounts of emails, I imagine. Was he personally interested? Was he a technophobe, a technophile?
I think that the technophilia has sometimes been exaggerated. To the best of my knowledge, and I take this from the most reliable sources, he did not buy a PC until 1989, which for a complete radical or something would seem a bit late. But he already wrote on electric typewriters, and he started that very early in his life, and he actually talks about this being a fundamental change. So when he comes across Nietzsche, philosophizing in an aside on the impact of the typewriter, and Heidegger too, he of course sees this. There is this sense that he clearly understood what McLuhan understood, and that is that we grow up in a media technological environment that after a while is so unquestioned and becomes such a narcotic atmosphere that you have to step aside with a rigorous step to understand it. But yet he did follow along. He did go into coding. After building his own synthesizers, by welding them together, he switched into the digital age by becoming a coding, and some of his programs and his coding achievements are now actually in the archive in Marbach. He's the very first professor of literature where the inheritance also includes his computer work, which has actually changed the way the archive is to do business.
It's interesting there that you said that there's got to be a point where you've got to step aside, because this actually draws in, I think, perfectly with something immediately with the Heidegger influence that I sort of feel I have to bring in. So we have this sort of foundation with regards to this possibly not fully agreed Hegelian understanding of media moving forward, which in itself is a movement which is a critique of the typical philosophical subject. But you mentioned this sort of stepping aside to look at this. It doesn't seem at this point that Kittler would be very sympathetic to retreating to a little hut in the woods and carving out a well and going back to some sort of form of Heideggerian authenticity of that type.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you have done shows on Heidegger and you've done shows on Günther Anders, who comes up with this great term. This is a cobbler's ontology. This is basically a 19th century artisan workshop. No, he would not. Let me do this the other way around to make this as accessible as possible and to bring in Pink Floyd. There is the famous statement by McLuhan, the medium is the message. Now, Kittler would add to that, the most important message of the medium is that it is itself a medium. The most impressive analysis delivered by Kittler, and they are very much on the top literary analysis you can come across, is his reading of a famous poem by Goethe, Wander's Night Song. It is a reading of the Siren Song in Homer's Odyssey, sorry. It is, of course, a reading or a listening of Brain Damage. And if you remember the lyrics of Brain Damage, from The Lunatic is on the Grass all the way to The Lunatic is in my head, it is, according to Kittler, a song about the electronic production of songs. He comes up with a term which is now being bandied about, which makes full use of the German compound Ds. It is ein Diskurs über Diskurskanalbedingungen, which in English is a discourse on discourse channel conditions. So he, in his work, is looking at performances in a given media format that thematize this performance. He's looking at a song, Pink Floyd, which according to him is about the development of the audio technology from little shellac record players, which you play outside in the grass, which then come into the hall, into my hall, and which then, with the advent of headphones and stereophone technology, are quite literally in your head, so that there is, to quote the famous song, a voice in your head, but it's not me. By the same token, he looks at other textual performances where texts talk about their own production. You cannot step aside. Rather, what you do is you look at a given performance in a given discourse network that thematizes its own media conditions to see how it reveals itself. And that here he lynches on, he basically connects with Foucault in Madness in Society. What is mad? Mad is no longer believing that you are in control of your statements. Mad is the necessity to constantly having talk about the fact that you are being meant to talk. So look at those utterances and we will then see how this works. This is not a stepping aside. This is, to quote my friend Jesse Paragal, going under the hood, taking apart the machinery to see how it works, be it a machinery of words or machinery of a digital apparatus.
There's a lot in there with regards to madness. So this sort of recursiveness of discourse on discourse, which is Kittler's most famous statement, it seems, discourse on discourse channel conditions, which itself is recursive and seems that it might possibly go on like, the famous statement, it's turtles all the way down. At what point does that discourse, that metatextual, meta, post, continual self-analysis ever end? And I think we're beginning to see the social hangover of what happens when that sort of highly ironic, highly cynical, highly self-knowing media output is ramped up. Everyone becomes a bit jaded because you can't actually trust media anymore, and notions of whether or not anything is sincere are almost made impossible, which is a sort of place of madness. But I think also this madness is connected to whether or not what is the subject and I guess this ties in more so with Lacan. So drawing on Lacan, I guess, with respect to this media this media unconscious we've been talking about, is the subject now, whatever that is fully constructed simply from this ongoing process, and what does the subject actually have of its own? Or what even is the subject, I guess, is the simple question there.
Let's start at the beginning. The most famous statement by Kittler is probably the opening line of Gramophone Film Typewriter: "Media determine our situation, which, in spite or because of it, deserves a description." Now, most people only quote the first half, "Media determine our situation," and then come up with the, I believe, intellectually and morally bankrupt diagnosis that he's a techno-determinist. Because the second half of the sentence actually says something different. We can still describe it, although we're being determined. So, but to get straight to your question, one of the great things he admired about Foucault, in spite of the rather patronizing attitude he took towards Foucault later in life, was that Foucault, unlike Nietzsche, unlike Heidegger, came to a breakdown point but did not go into a big exercise of self-reassertion. He did not come up with the Nietzschean Superman. He did not come up with the Heideggerian resoluteness, be it individual or, as of 1933, collective. Foucault did not do that. He went on into other things. To your question, the human subject, of course, is constructed. We are basically strung out on the clotheslines of signifiers, as Lacan would say. But what you talked about before, what you asked about before, the Hegelian vista is in a way an answer to that. You cannot get to the bottom. There are ongoing descriptions, but you can give an overview of the history in which these descriptions take place, which is an ontological history. That you can do, and that hasn't been done before, and that he did not manage to do. If he had been able to complete it, there would have been the absolute recursion. He would have returned to his early days in Freiburg, and he now would have been able to rephrase and update Heidegger in a way which Heidegger, with his misunderstanding of mathematics and slight fear of cybernetics, never really got to show that we are parts of a cybernetically progressing history of ontologies. He would never use these terms as I would do them now. This is a simplification, though, which tries to give a response to response to a question: where do you end? You do not end anywhere. You end in nature processing itself, which at one point it used us to do.
So I guess to try bring this to a more contemporaneous, accessible question with regards to technology. In a Kittlerian sense, I think we can all agree that there is much talk of a loss of typically human values, communication, community, otherness, probably take any of them, to be honest, with respect to our relationship with technology. So in a Kittlerian sense, what is currently happening with our relationship with technology, which seems to be, at least in the media agreement, that the human is sort of being completely lost. And, our relationship to the world is one that is the majority of the time interfaced.
Let's speculate for a moment that he was still alive and he's been asked about the most recent developments. What would he say about social media? What would he say about ChatGPT? I don't think he would have a lot to say about social media. He really wasn't interested. And for him, probably he would go along the usual lines. This is basically people living along in the little narcissistic bubbles, contained but supported by a technology which is all the more effective the less they understand it. With regard to ChatGPT, I think that he would be more interested. I mean, we are dealing with large language models. And what is that? It is a machine programmed with learning algorithms that can recognize and summarize and predict and generate content using very large data sets. That sounds a bit like you and me. We are not as good as it as a machine, but isn't that the definition of a human speaker, or even like a community of speaker? And this goes back to what I said before. It is the great dream to find generative rules. But in a way, with ChatGPT, language comes into its own. It is now processing itself without recourse through human mouths and minds. He would not use words like loss. He would consider that sentimental and still kind of a residue of our anguish over the loss of anthropocentric attitudes. But he would say that to a certain extent, we are now epiphenomenal to language processing itself.
With regards to the media then, in with respect to language, is there a case in which our language, via this progression of this progression of media ontologies, is possibly getting more and more limited? Our own subject relationship with this media unconscious is one in which the language is decomplexifying. We're becoming less articulate.
Empirically, I wonder whether that is true, because we're producing more and more languages. Neologisms are proliferating at a horrific pace. So I don't think so. I don't think he would be particularly interested in a question like this, because again, it would be human-centric. But the fact of the matter is that the more powerful the media technology, the less it is sometimes observed or recognized. And precisely the increase of language would not be us reasserting some kind of human capability. It would just mean that the machines are really good at making us believe what we can do.
Kittler is speaking on behalf of the machines?
Not on behalf of the machines. This is one of the great mistakes that are done. It is sometimes confusing the oeuvre of Friedrich Kittler with that of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that is that he is basically rewriting the Terminator movie. The machines are rising up against us. He is far too Heideggerian not to sense anthropocentrism in that. I mean, what a work of art is man that the machines would zero in on us. No, the machines do their own stuff, and if they take us out, that's collateral damage. It is not something they have in mind. He would say that that is the Pinocchio fallacy, as if assumed creations have got nothing better to do than to be like us. So this standoff is really for him not very interesting.
So, I guess everyone is trembling with fear at this question. Where do the machines and humans end up for Kittler? Or was he fairly open about that future?
I think he was, first of all, he was far too familiar with the contingencies of media evolution to make predictions on that point. Sometimes, very rarely, he talks about, in a way, you have to look at this in different time zones. The machines are operating in different times, and we are operating in our own times and underneath the geological times. So he comes up with the idea of what is now called possibly a chronosynosis. That is an ecology of times in which various processing apparatuses, including humans, are operating. But what he would not accept is this confrontational idea, because he would say that is simply, once again, us putting ourselves in the center, not in the center of the universe, but in the center of the crosshairs of the machine, and that is narcissism.
Okay. Speaking of narcissism, to step into the more controversial side of Kittler's work, with regard to this media and the development of it, it then will, of course, have some knock-on effects as to the sincerity of what it is we are saying as opinionated human beings via the media. And so what happens, what happens to our understanding of politics from this media, whatever we need a name for it really, but this media, what we've been speaking about?
I don't think that he is a very good source or help talking about these problems. He was personally more on the conservative side. That is part of his biography we can talk about. I think that he would, to a certain degree, fully go along with the conventional analyses that what we have is now an ecology which allows for screening out what you don't want to know and screening in or concentrating on what you want to know.
Mm.
And he was fully aware of the fact that the digital machinery is extremely well positioned to enforce narcissism on an individual and on a group level. He would have no difficulties accepting that. But for him, that really wasn't an interesting problem.
With regard to his influence from Foucault, who would see the left and right as more of a murky territory, was Kittler not along these lines?
No, I think that it's a bit difficult. We need to go into the biography a bit to understand it. As you say, as you already pointed out, he's born in 1943, so he spends a lot of his formative childhood in the former German Democratic Republic, i.e. East Germany. He is part of a family, son of a father who, by all accounts, is quite conservative and has difficulties with the new regime. So the family flees in 1958. They move to the southwest German town of Lahr, which is in the vicinity of Freiburg. So he goes to Freiburg in 1963. And now it is the 60s. He suddenly is confronted with a lot of fellow students who seem to be peddling the very ideology from which the family fled. So you can see there's little love lost there. It is not that he is a raving conservative, but what he sees is he sees in the 60s ideology, also in its Frankfurt variation, a continuation of a narcissistic subject philosophy, which is quoting ontological chimera you have to get rid of. That is why he turns to the French. That is why he turns to very much the early Foucault. If you look at the Foucault quotes, they will stop with the archaeology of knowledge. After that, there's very, very little, because the great Foucault was the Foucault of the order of things, which is this very distant look, which is a book which at one point points out the importance of the year 1795 for the switch between epistemes, but which does not mention the French Revolution. Hitler loved that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to struggle to segue into the other topic, which is probably the most controversial part of Kittler's thought. So it's going to be a bad segue, but because we need to talk about it. Off the back of politics, war, and really, I guess, off the back of everything we've been speaking about in a way, is war as a possible accelerative force for technology, for this media ecology, and with regards to that media ecology, and in terms of from it, the singular ontologies which inform what it is to be political of either stripe, war is the accelerative force behind the evolution, the development of all these things.
Let's take a deep breath. We need to do two things. Number one, I can give a very short, straightforward summary of the idea. And then we need to go into the biography a bit, also because it is quite revealing. Essentially, war operates as what I would call a triple M model. War is the motor or the model, and certainly the motivation for Kittler's media theory. At his most stringent, and this is in the early 80s, culminating in his now legendary war literature seminar in Freiburg, there is the idea that essentially everything in the entertainment industry is an abuse of army equipment. So all modern media technologies are born in war. He softens this a bit in many instances by saying, no, there are extraneous origins, but war is kind of the puberty, the formative early phase, the thing that brings media really into being. Next to it, and that is not the same, is a more rhetorical gambit, which puts war as the motor. War, and incidentally revolutions, are in a way the cataracts, the rapids, which allow for the accelerated evolution of technology, quite simply because, to put it as in plain English as possible, you've got a weapon and I have to outdo your weapon. And once I've outdone your weapon, you need a weapon to outdo my weapon. So the very idea of the supersession of technologies, the very idea of technological evolution taking on an accelerated format and being observable takes place in war. Those are the two things for the general theoretical alignment, why war is so important. You can now come up with many, many empirical counterexamples, and he wouldn't say no. But in the end, he would say we need, and there is a lot of evidence for the fact that wars and revolutions, currently I'm working on a paper on his view of the Romanian Revolution, which of course is a media revolution, which is a rapid and accelerator, a certain narrow point, a needle's eye, which accelerates and which clearly streamlines the evolution of media. Teflon was developed in war. Telegraphy was developed in war. What other proof do we need? Now, biography. So he's born in 1943, at the end of the war. And in a way, you could say that Kittler was not born during the war. He was born into the war, and he never really got out. In the 1950s, 53, 54, 56, 58, if I remember the numbers correctly, he and his brother Wolf and his mother take summer holidays on the island of Usedom, which is at the Baltic Sea. And if you know your military paraphernalia and if you geek out on Nazi technology, you know that is where Peenemünde is, i.e. the original testing site and manufacturing site for the V2. And in those days especially, you could still see the scars of Operation Hydra. That is the Brits and Americans bombing the island in August of 1943, which prompts the Germans to move manufacture to the concentration camps and into Thuringia on the mountains. Now, Kittler sees this, and in a very remarkable short autobiographical essay, which is available in the collection Operation Valhalla, you can see something happening. He is growing up in a regime which has a very, very one-sided view of the war. The war was a liberation brought about by our brothers, socialist brothers from the East, whereas the individual memories and the collective memories in the East Germany Kittler grows up with are of a very different war. In a book-length interview, which unfortunately is not available in English, he tells an interesting story. His father, who was a director of studies, temporarily out of job, of course, under the new regime, was a great Goethe scholar. So at age 7, Kittler says that he knew parts of Goethe off by heart. At the same time, his half-brother was a former radio operator in the German Luftwaffe who, scavenging parts from downed airplanes, is reassembling radios on the kitchen table to impress the local girls. And so the entire oeuvre of Kittler is there on the kitchen table at age 7. Goethe and gadgets, the Discourse Network 1800, the Discourse Network 1900, and the pervasive impact of war. And so he now starts, especially in the 80s, and amongst other reading people you are very familiar with, like Ernst Jünger, but especially Thomas Pynchon. And the huge impact of Pynchon is that Pynchon is describing a world war, or at least one of his characters says so, which is very much along the lines of the German theorist Kittler. The Second World War was not a war between different political systems. This answers your question again. It's not important. It is not a war between ideologies. It is a war between different technological systems that are trying to bring about a fusion by accelerating, bringing this together. The war is a war between Bletchley Park, Peenemünde, and Los Alamos. The Brits are providing the guidance system, the Germans are providing the delivery system, and the Americans are providing the payload. So the Second World War is actually an accelerated technology transfer. And in one of the more famous books, in Gravity's Rainbow, that is said what the war was about. The ideologies and the politics, that is all destruction. In reality, it's technological systems trying to get together. So war here has almost become a self-conscious entity that is absolutely indispensable for bringing together streams of technology into the universal weapon that is the digitally guided intercontinentalism.
In that sense, then, it seems, and it's intriguing because McLuhan also had his own obsession with Finnegan's Wake, another novel of a stylistic type. I'm not going to say exactly the same, but of a stylistic type that has this sort of explosion of what language can and will be. Kittler has this relationship with Gravity's Rainbow, and quite literally with the V2 in Biography. And so for anyone who's read Gravity's Rainbow, they will understand what I mean by this, and I can't really do a good job in explaining it. But it seems that in the way one has to read Gravity's Rainbow is the way in which human beings will begin to be in the future. Does that make any sense? There is this ruin of linearity. You're not sure what exactly is speaking, whether or not it's a dream, whether or not it is the desire being projected, whether or not it is possibly the bomb speaking, what story is where. The whole thing makes sense only if you are able to approach it in a way that is sort of overhauling everything.
Remember what we spoke about before, the idea of a discourse or discourse channel conditions. The very best examples to explain it are either texts, poems, odes, or songs like Brain Damage, which thematize themselves. But in order to do that, in order to understand the paranoia of the proverbial guy under the bridge who believes that the CIA has implanted cathodes in his brain, you yourself have to be a bit paranoid. And of course, paranoia is written straight through the entire novel. And now the paranoia extends to the reader who looks at this book and says it might be completely out there and abstruse, but actually it is all factually true. So when I started meeting him again, it was a constant paranoid drive to take everything in the novel and to find empirical facts to back it up. Captain Blicero might be a very strange character. In reality, it is SS General Hans Kammler, who in the end was in charge of the V2 production. So everything in there has a root in factual history. That is the first thing. Yes, the idea, there's also a slight utopian dream there, James. Remember, Slothrop goes into the zone. He goes into a Germany where the war is both over and not yet over. And it is something which completely opens up the political space for any kind of trajectory. And I think in his more lyrical modes, Kittler took to that something may have gone wrong in 1935. And that is that there were so many open possibilities, and what happens, the two systems lock in and begin their Cold War. That said, I think we cannot let this pass without leveling some critique. In your show, you have often spoken about Spengler. Now, Spengler is not completely unlike Kittler. And one of the things that makes them so is that they have both provided great loser theories. Remember, Spengler writes the first volume of The Decline of the West before the First World War ends. As a matter of fact, he's still convinced that the Germans are going to win the war, which in a way says something about Spengler's powers of prediction. But what makes the Decline of the West so interesting and so attractive to many readers is that it is a re-explanation of a war in which losing the war is less important than understanding it. It was one great step forward in the civilizing of culture, moving into the great sterile end phase of history. And there it no longer matters so much whether Germany has won or lost the war, because it is better to be an understanding loser than a blind winner. Yes, we've lost the war, but we've understood what the war is about. Now look at Kittler. We've lost the war, but I've now understood what the war is about, that the war is about forces which do not appear in the other accounts. Here, of course, one has to step back and say, wait a minute, WTF? All this only makes sense if you have a war which is deprived of politics, meaning there is no Hitler in Hitler's war. There is no genocide. There is no collusion of Wehrmacht and SS. It, of course, is a technologically sanitized war from beginning to end. But it allows for one way of digesting history by looking at war as an instantiation of a techno-supersubject.
It's a coincidence. I recently wrote a piece for Diffractions on where Spengler went wrong, in my own estimation. And I'm glad you brought up Spengler. I mean, if we think about, his last book, The Hour of Decision, he's still emphatically, as far as I'm concerned, and this is what I write in my own piece, Spengler is the most emphatically human philosopher. And human in flesh, mortality, organic cultures, everything is tied back to some notion of human life, death, and rebirth on a grander scale. But also, I mean, you can't go a page without him cluttering it with notions of honor, blood, race, authenticity, extremely human notions. But in his oversight there is that when he brings in things such as the money spirit, I guess what in German that would be something Geist, but he will never allow that to be subordinate. That will always be subordinate to the human. Once the human and the human culture dies, well, that thing dies out. Whereas it seems that the Kittlerian transition is, well, actually, you need to pay closer attention to the money spirit, closer attention to, I guess, the spirit of technology, because that's actually becoming its own agency, its own thing, and the human is withering away, whereas Spengler's stuck, I think, in a, it's very determined and set.
A couple of things. All academic careers are decided by random encounters at hotel bars. In 1995, I was at a conference in LA, and I was approached by one of the very experienced editors for Stanford University Press, who had overheard me talking about Kittler, and who came up and said, are you familiar with Gramophone typewriter? And I said, yes, I was very marginally involved when he wrote the book. And that is how my friend Michael Wutz and I ended up translating it. And one of the good things about translating that book was that we, as very young, completely unknown scholars, were given the opportunity to introduce it. And remember, the introduction to Discourse Networks by David Welbery is a very, very great piece of work, one of the best introductions to Kittler ever written. And so we had a tour order, and I was wrestling to see how can we bring this man up to date. And so I came up with an idea, which I borrowed from Geoffrey Winthrop-Young, who wrote the famous book in 1984, Reactionary Modernism, which is about Jünger and Spengler in particular. And the idea is that unlike the usual technophobia of German conservatism, there's something here which has this Janus-type appearance. On the one hand, the idea that conservatism, radical conservatism, should embrace the most modern, even futurist technology. And at the other side, the insistence on the greater value of pre-modern societal organization. So you're backwards and forwards looking. You can have a world of the most modern technology which works together with pre-modern, maybe even archaic societal structures. And to a certain extent, he applies that to Jünger and to Spengler. And then we thought, let's call this postmodern reactionism, which was not a good choice. But we said there is a similarity here. There's a similarity between, in a way, a very conservative stance that fully embraces the technological, the hyper-technological modern. With regard to Spengler, he would also point out certain ideas that Spengler puts forward in one of his last books, the book on technics, where he actually talks about human evolution, and where he says human evolution is driven by weapons. And so the very first thing, of course, is the hand as a weapon. So the militarization of human evolution is already written in onto the biological level. Kittler never went there. He had no truck with biology. That's one of the reasons he never really took to social systems theories. But he would agree with that it is in a way in the aggressive exchange with the environment that media are made, that humans are made and unmade. He would, however, never go along with this ground perspective, the morphological perspective, because that A, gives you a predictability he would deny, and B, he would say, in a way, critical of Spengler, what you said, the idea of not letting loose of the human is Spengler's nostalgia. After all, he said the epoch he would have loved to have lived in and which he was at home was the Rococo epoch. He was already behind his times and he's clinging to it despite all the posturing to the contrary.
Well, exactly right. I mean, I'm not sure where to go from there. Was there anything you'd like to add about Kittler that you feel is key?
I think that if people who do not know him want to read him, I think that there are individual essays, the famous essays, There Is No Software or No Such Agency, which are very good. They're in the early collection on media and information. But the best thing would be just to get a copy of Gramophone Film Typewriter and to start with the gramophone section, which I think is the best section. The film section is not good. He himself admitted he wasn't very good on optical media. And also his introduction. And the other thing is, for those who are interested in the war business, there's a recent collection from GQP, Operation Valhalla, which contains many of his war-related essays and for which I wrote a long introduction. And if you are interested in the military connection, that would be a point to start. The other thing is, he is quite present on YouTube. The problem is that many of the clips are taken when he's already fairly old and frail. So it is a bit difficult to go along with it.
Is he? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
Is he fairly well known in Germany? Is it,
Yes, I would say that in academic circles, certainly. I think that in the world abroad, there was a Kittler moment in North America, which I think has peaked. I think that there is an interesting reception in Latin America, but by far the most interesting, and this, of course, is historically quite revealing, there is a fairly small but active Japanese reception. And there is now also fairly small but active Chinese reception, which on the surface makes no sense at all. But if you look at the Japanese social history, and if you know of despite all the great differences between the history of Germany and Japan, the great similarities in terms of the dialectics of the techno-social evolution, it does make sense. The role of media in German history and the role of media in Japanese history. So one of the best books is by Seth Bukowitz on the Meiji Restoration, which actually is a Kittlerian book on the Great Revolution, the technological revolution, discursive revolution, political revolution in 1870s Japan, which is essentially the switch from discourse network 1800, 1900 applied to Japan.
Okay. Are you currently working on any more, probably in German, but are you working on any more English books on Kittler?
No, I'm currently what I think will be the very last thing. Together with my colleague Ilinka Iascu, we've translated one of his last interviews, which is on the Romanian Revolution of 1989, which, if you will recall, is a big theory issue for everybody from Zizek to Badiou to Wilhelm Flusser, because it is the alleged first televised revolution. And there's a remarkable interview with Kittler full of very strange tangents about this revolution, which we've translated, and we're now writing a commentary. But I think, to be quite honest, that's it then.
That's it for you and Kittler?
Yes. I mean, I'm interested in other things. The last paper I wrote was one in his view of Richard Wagner, that the entire revolution doesn't take place in politics. It only takes place in Wagner's operas. That was fun to do, but this will be the last.
Any reason why, or just?
I think that to a certain extent, my personal lemon has been squeezed dry. Okay. There's a lot of work to do, especially on the technical side. I'm not competent to do it. And there's also, I guess, a certain fatigue component. But most importantly is I'm interested in other things, which partly take the departure from German media theory. I now do work on chronopolitics, which to a certain extent is related to German media archaeology. But I think specifically Kittler, that's it.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put links for your own book on Kittler in the description below and for other Kittler-related things. But Geoffrey Winthrop-Young, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. It was a great conversation. Take care.